going to go ahead and get started as we have, as you can see from the schedule, a pretty packed day. So, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Mosser, along with my colleague Lorinc. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Seeking Security Conference here at UT. I've got a few very general remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, to Lorinc. So we're here today in a number of different capacities for a number of different reasons. First, we're here to discuss the changing nature of European security, as we say there, the emerging coherence of European foreign and security policy. I'm very happy to say that we've gathered some of Europe's finest scholars with us here today on what really is a weather that should make them feel right at home. That's why we gave them the weather that we did. We're happy to have Europe and America's finest scholars to share their thoughts on the evolving security parameters in the European foreign and security policy architecture. But we're also pleased to have three distinguished practitioners with us, and I will introduce each in a second here, to give us some much needed grounding as we pursue the academic line of inquiry. Finally, we've got three renowned and distinguished commentators, academic commentators, who are going to train their, what I would say, well-honed minds on our academic papers and try to help us find and maybe refine the flaws in our arguments. So before I turn the podium over to my colleague Lawrence Redei of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, I'd like to say a few brief words of thanks to everybody who's made this conference possible. First, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the conference. We've got a wide-ranging array of sponsors, many of whom are represented in other institutions across the campus. First, I'd like to thank the Center for European Studies and the European Union Center of Excellence here at UT for the majority of the funding and logistical support for this particular conference. Also, the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the LBJ School, the Clements Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft at UT, the Plan 2 Honors Program, International Relations and Global Studies, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Niels and Maria Maritz Family Endowment. All of these have given us either financial or logistical support in putting this conference on, and we thank them all immensely. I'd like to thank the participants, some of whom you see here in the front, some of whom are in the audience with you, in alphabetical order, only in alphabetical order as far as I can tell anyway. Scen Biscop from the Egmont Institute in Brussels, Maya Kapolani Davis Cross in the audience from Northeastern University and Arena in Norway, Chantal Ladale also in the audience from the University of Montreal European Union Center, Niels van Willigen from the University of Leiden, Jan Vokel from Cairo University, and finally Ken McDonough, who couldn't be here with us today but is a member of our group and hopefully will be with us here at some point in the future. I'd like to thank the discussants up front, Rafael Biermann at Friedrich Schiller University, University of Jena in Germany. Later on we'll be joined by Pat McDonald from the UT Government Department and Jeremy Suri from UT Austin in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And the practitioners, Lars-Erik Lundin, who is the former head of the EU delegation to the international organizations in Vienna, Bert Rasmussen, Bert, I've done that multiple times. He's a political advisor to Deputy Secretary General Maciej Popowski of the European External Action Service, and Richard Froh, who is the recently retired Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Operations at NATO. Finally, well not quite finally, but almost, we've got two student presenters today, later on, two student participants, Jennifer Johnson from Plan 2 Honors, Aaron Banduk from Government Honors. I'd also like to thank you all, the audience, for showing up at 8:30 on a beautiful day, as I say. Please partake of the food and beverages that we've got there for you. That's your reward for showing up and listening to us. And finally, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again, special thanks to Sally Dixon and Ni Wen at the Center for European Studies and the European Union Center of Excellence, without whom none of this would be possible. There's a lot of those without whoms, but that one really is legitimate, and without Sally we wouldn't be here today. So we've got a full day planned. We've got a formal public session this morning. The scholars are going to present arguments in a traditional academic conference format, no more than 15 minutes each, with a commentary by the two discussants to follow. And we will sort of break this up. Then we'll have a break for lunch, and we'll reconvene after lunch for a final panel session before sending practitioners and the student participants off to discuss their papers. while we academics decamp to a private session to really bang our heads against the wall about our own papers. We'll end the day with a public session. The practitioners come back in the public spotlight at 5 o'clock for the public forum on current challenges to European security. All of you are invited. That will be in the next room over. So thanks again for coming. Thanks in advance for your participation and for your interest in what we hope will be a watershed moment for discussions of European security. So with that, my job is done. I turn it to my colleague, and thanks again.
All right, thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of you for braving the early morning hour and the terrible weather. What I'm going to do today is present the paper that Michael and I wrote together. And it's essentially the framework paper that sort of tries to pull together the rest of the papers and provides a certain context for the rest of the papers that you will be hearing today. And this is about the general European security architecture, and especially the role of the EU within this architecture. And in it, we essentially argue three things, and those are the 3 points I want to go over today. First, that the nature of security challenges in Europe has changed over the past 2 decades. 2, that we find that scholars who think about European security don't necessarily reflect these changes and think about them in a way that's not complete. And the third point is that, in our view, in this new changed security setting in Europe, the European Union now plays a central role and plays what we call a catalytic role. And I will tell you more about what we mean by this catalytic role in a second. So I'm going to take these 3 points in turn, and then we'll turn it over to the other papers. So the first point, what does security in Europe mean today? So if you look at sort of the map of Europe, and then put all the traditional security organizations up on this map, right? The OSCE, Council of Europe, NATO, the EU. What's striking about this, right, is that all of these organizations are essentially relics of the Cold War. Right? They were set up in the Cold War, and most of them have not changed significantly since the end of the Cold War. And we argue that this is a problem because the security challenges facing Europe have changed since the end of the Cold War. Now, I'm aware that every single security presentation at every single conference starts with, we're no longer in the Cold War, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't want to leave this on the sort of very general, oh, we're in a brand new world type of discussion. What we really mean by this is that, and this is sort of our main point, is that strictly security challenges in Europe have essentially become extinct. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the post-Cold War security threats to Europe, they are much better described as foreign and security policy issues rather than just strictly security ones. So think about a couple of examples. If you think about Libya, right? There the issue for Europe was how to protect civilians in Benghazi who are about to be massacred, how to secure Libya's borders from having different neighboring countries import weapons into Libya, how to manage immigration from Libya to Europe, how to set up functioning political parties in Libya so that after the violence is done, they can set up some sort of democracy, and humanitarian relief. How do you get humanitarian relief into Libya? Right? So this is a complex foreign and security policy question. Right? It's not just a question of, oh, we need to set up a front line that we need to defend. And similarly in Ukraine, if you think about it, right? I mean, it's about oil and gas flows, it's about democracy promotion, it's about corruption, it's about geopolitics with Russia, it's about government debt, it's about a potential ethnic conflict that's starting there, right? So it's about minority rights issues, so it's a complex picture. And in this sort of new post-Cold War situation where security threats are now foreign and security policy threats, we are especially interested in what role the EU is playing. And others have thought about this too, and what I'm going to tell you in the sort of second part of the presentation is how scholars have thought about this so far and how we are going to sort of try and reconceptualize it. So I want to go through 2 sets of conventional wisdom for you and then offer our sort of alterations or modifications to it. So the first conventional wisdom that people use to sort of look at how what role the EU plays in European security is to basically just draw a line and say, well, there's sort of low intensity tasks that need to be done and high intensity tasks that need to be done. And then you put, you know, sort of the soft security actors like the OSCE or the Council of Europe on the left, and you put the hard security actors, NATO and the member states that make up NATO and the EU on the right, right? They're the ones with the armies. And the essential idea was that the EU is basically very close to the soft side, right? The EU mostly does soft security. And there's a sort of variation on this, which is basically saying, well, yeah, it's on the left side, but it's sort of moving a little bit towards more hard security actions, right? So by setting up a common security and defense policy, by having, by actually engaging in more missions, it's sort of creeping towards the right, right? And there's all kinds of literature about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Right? But the expectation is that it's not going to turn into a full-fledged, you know, hard security actor. So this conventionalism really talks about this movement as sort of a haphazard, not really strategic movement, and essentially the EU is still put in the sort of left part of this graph. So there's another conventional wisdom which is a little bit more complicated, and this talks about operations in a more complex way by looking also at the intensity of operations on the x-axis, but on the y-axis, if you can tilt your heads, it says the level of required civil-military coordination. And what we mean by this is that there are certain missions and certain security tasks that require a lot of coordination between civilian and military means, right? And so where is the EU in this? Well, the OSCE and the Council of Europe are still sort of on the in the bottom left, right? So you have not a lot of coordination that's necessary, and you have fairly low intensity operations. NATO and the member states are on the right, right? They have to do a lot of intense military operations, but they also don't have to coordinate too much. And the EU is in the middle, right? So one of the ways in which this has been expressed, and if you read this literature at all, you will have heard this ad nauseum, is the idea of comprehensive security, right? So what the EU does is that it launches missions that bring together civilian means, military means, political means, diplomatic means, democracy promotion means, etc. Right? So think about what the EU is doing in Kosovo. Right? So sending both peacekeeping forces, training police, overseeing judicial reform, right? So pulling all these strands together and trying to coordinate it. Right? So what makes the EU sort of stand out is that essentially it's playing a niche role, right? So there are these sort of mid-level security situations that aren't, you know, really about the defense of the continent, but they also aren't as soft as certain foreign policy questions that maybe you can deal with in the OSCE or the Council of Europe. And these mid-level security situations usually require a very complicated mix of reactions and responses. And the EU is sort of this niche actor that knows exactly how to combine all of these and put all of these together, right? Because it has a lot of different means at its disposal. So that's the sort of second conventional wisdom. And what Michael and I argue is that both of these views are flawed. The first is a little bit too simplistic, right? I mean, not all security challenges today can just simply be put on a hard to soft axis, and that doesn't tell us very much. And if you think of the Ukraine, that's a good example, right? I mean, is the Ukraine a soft case or a hard case? Well, there's certain parts of it, you know, the association agreement that needs to be signed with the EU that's about trade. That's how this whole thing blew up. But on the other hand, now there's a war going on, so there's clearly a hard security aspect to it. And the second idea with the sort of graph that I showed you, to us seems a little bit too EU-centric, in the sense that the idea of the second conventional wisdom is that the EU can do it all, right? It can do the military part, the police reform part, the trade part, the humanitarian relief part, the political consulting part, the democracy promotion part, all of that stuff on its own. But it really can't, right? And even when it sort of pretends to do so, the picture is a little bit more complicated. And so let me give you a very brief example. In the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, the EU helped craft an agreement guaranteeing minority rights. Right? It launched a peacekeeping mission to keep violence at bay. it used its leverage that comes from its EU enlargement process to pressure leaders into accepting political reform, right? But all of these steps actually required a bunch of other security actors, right? So the military part of it couldn't have happened without NATO. The minority rights policy couldn't have happened without the OSCE and the Council of Europe. And this whole enlargement lever, right, is dependent on the EU's member states also being willing to go forward with EU enlargement, right? So somehow that picture just seems a bit too EU-centric. At the same time, we still think that the EU is somehow at the center of it all, right? So how do you sort of make sense of this? And so our idea is to think of the EU as a catalyst, right? And it's harder to sort of draw this up in a graph, right? But the idea is that the EU is at the center of a network. And its role is not necessarily to do everything on its own, but to get other organizations to act coherently with each other. And the reasons that we think that the EU's role really lies in this catalytic aspect is because it has two things that no other organizations have, no other security organizations have. The first is that the EU is the only actor with this incredibly high density of institutional links to other organizations, right? So the EU is connected to all of these different other bubbles. Those bubbles aren't connected to each other necessarily, right? So NGOs and NATO don't interact very much. The Council of Europe and NATO don't interact very much, right? But the EU interacts with all of them. And the second thing is that, and this is potentially even more important, the EU is really the only actor with the ability to look at foreign and security policy questions holistically. What I mean by that is, if you think about it, there's no NATO setting in which you can talk about minority rights and make decisions or launch missions that have to do with minority rights. At the same time, the Council of Europe can't really discuss, nor does it discuss, counter-piracy measures off the coast of Africa. It just doesn't have the institutional setup to do so. That's not in its remit. Right? But the EU can, and actually does, think about all of these issues strategically together. Right? There are several institutions of the EU, whether it's the External Action Service, whether it's the European Council, whether it's the European Parliament, that actually think about these issues together as these complex foreign and security policy problems. So, for this reason, we argue that the EU is really at the center of this European foreign and security policy architecture. And what I want to be clear about, and this is the last point I want to make, is that we're not arguing that the EU necessarily does this well. Right? So this is not an argument that the EU is somehow the savior and it's in the middle, right? And it's coming in on its probably not a white horse but a blue horse, right, to save the day. Our point is that it can create these linkages and this cooperation among the various institutions, and when it goes well, such as I would argue in Macedonia, it can achieve a lot by bringing all these actors together. But if it doesn't perform this role, right, then what we're dealing with is a catalyst that doesn't work, right, which is also an option. So all we're arguing is that in this structure, that's the role that it should be playing and that it can play. But we're not arguing that it always does play that, right? And I would argue that, for instance, in the Ukraine case, the EU failed to play this role, and that's one of the reasons that we see such a mess over there. So I'm going to leave it at that, but this sort of gets you to these main ideas of what we mean by the EU as a catalyst, and why we think that it's important in this new foreign and security policy architecture. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Scen, I believe, and talk a little bit more about a subsection of this, which is capabilities, and how the EU has played a role in trying to raise the capabilities of European member states. So thank you very much, and I will hand over to Scen. You don't have one of these, right?
Nope.
I'm just going to put this page.
One of my good friends always says some people have PowerPoint, other people have a point, but company accepted, of course. But I just like to stand when I talk. Thank you for the invitation, first of all, once again. Very interesting opportunity to interact with other than my usual Brussels-based audience of mostly EU enthusiastic people. I'm one of those rare people in Brussels, although Bert is another one of them. There are still a few Belgians in Brussels, but you have to know where to find them in this business of European security. Contrary to what you might think, Belgium is a state with a very clear grand strategy. We know what we want. Throughout history, the strategic role of Belgium has always been to provide nice battlefields to the other powers of Europe. The only way to prevent the powers of Europe from fighting themselves to death in Belgium is to have them talk themselves to death in the meeting rooms of Brussels. So promoting these meetings, promoting European cooperation is our grand strategy, and so far you could say we've been quite successful at it. But today, of course, I have to talk about the European picture, European grand strategy, if such a thing exists. And I want to make the usual 3 points. First point, support your local sheriff. If you don't support your local sheriff, you can of course hope that the US cavalry will come and save you instead. But the message that we're getting in Europe, an ever stronger message I think, is that the US cavalry might not always be inclined to come, not automatically, that it will not automatically take the initiative whenever there is a problem in our neighborhood. Hence we have to think we ourselves, well, which responsibilities for which until now we counted on the US cavalry do we have to assume ourselves, and which are the capability implications of that? For what do we Europeans feel responsible, and what do we want to be able to do autonomously? And autonomously basically means without relying on American assets. That I think is the question. The problem is that this debate is hampered because there is no clear institutional focus for it. You have one European security architecture which comprises NATO, the European Union in all of its dimensions, and of course the states. And all of these do bits of strategy, but I would argue that none of them can really do grand strategy. If you understand grand strategy as a strategy for your foreign policy or external action in its entirety. I think some member states still think that they can do grand strategy, and they may come up with brilliant ideas about the ends and the ways, but they will find that they actually lack the means to then implement those brilliant strategies that they think up. You know, does any capital really think that they will deal alone with the Ukraine crisis or with Syria and Iraq? I don't think so. Of course, many people in the security sphere would think of NATO when you think of a place where the Europeans do strategy, but NATO is what it is. It's a military alliance, and as Lorinc already said, you cannot discuss all kinds of problems in NATO because they're simply outside NATO's purview. NATO doesn't have the ways to deal with the energy security of Europe, for example. So I would say that in theory the one best placed to think about grand strategy for Europeans is the EU, because the EU is the place where if Europeans want to, they can collectively address the full scope of foreign policy or international relations or external action, however you want to call it. Only the states do not always feel inclined to use the EU to that purpose, you know. If a crisis happens in Ukraine or in Syria, I think most, if not all people in the Belgian Foreign Ministry will think, how will the EU react? Meaning, how will we react through the EU? But I think in the Quai d'Orsay, in the Foreign Office, in the Auswärtiges Amt, they will probably think, how will France, or how will Britain, or how will Germany react? And as long as this is the default position, of course, the chances are that the EU will not do very much, or will only do so in the later stage. And this is the problem, I think, that there is no consensus on what should be the default platform that Europeans use to think strategically when something happens, to analyze it, to decide is it important, to decide then what has to be done and which means does this require. And we're still a bit stuck in the old theological debates about who should do what. It's getting better, and certainly at the working level between EU and NATO, everybody keeps telling me it works fine, but as soon as you try to formalize it, you still get stuck in the old debates, have to do with Turkey, Cyprus, autonomy and so on. And that is problematic. The result is also that we Europeans, so far I feel, have not answered this question of, okay, what do we want to be capable of ourselves autonomously? NATO doesn't answer that question, because what NATO does is to decide what does the alliance as a whole need to be able to do, and then translate that into targets for individual allies. But I think that most individual European allies will not be able to generate significant additional military capability. They don't have the means and the scale anymore. It will be cooperation in various formats between Europeans that will produce capability. And two, in most non-Article 5 type crises around Europe, it will not be NATO as a whole that will act. It will be various groups of European allies that will act. So the question is not what will the EU do, or what will NATO do, or what should an ad hoc coalition do. The question is this European bloc, the European allies and partners / EU member states, what do they want to be able to do autonomously, meaning without needing US assets, relying on their own strategic enablers. And as long as we don't answer that question, all our capability development efforts are in a way just up in the air, because there is no clear purpose of them. In theory, we have some answer to this question, because the EU defined already in 1999 its headline goal, want to be able to deploy 60,000 troops and sustain that for a year. But nobody's talked about that since the French EU presidency of 2008. You know, I was at a seminar in The Hague some time ago, and I made the same point, and somebody says, yes, we know the EU objective is to have 2 battle groups on standby. Well, 2 battle groups, that's 2 battalions. I mean, 2 battalions is about the strength of the Brussels Federal Police Force deployed for a European Council meeting. Certainly then that European Council meeting itself should be able to produce a few more than just the 2 battle groups. So there is no feeling of this ambition. Now, what many people forget is that the Europeans can actually sustain 60,000 troops in the field. For the last decade or so we have done so. Under the NATO flag, EU flag, UN flag, ad hoc coalitions. At any one time there have been 60,000 or more troops in the field for the last decade. But we could never have done that without the United States. These deployments mostly rely on American strategic enablers. And two, it's more or less the maximum that we can do. Meaning that, you know, if you have 40,000 Europeans in Afghanistan, you know, and 20,000 scattered around, and there's another major crisis in which you decide we want to act, you will find yourself scraping the bottom of the barrel. So it is problematic. So my first point is, we really need to think about the remit. What do we think our local sheriff should be able to do to then guide our capability development. Second point I want to make, for a few dollars more, or for a fistful of dollars, I couldn't quite decide between the two. The first level of capability development is building then our own strategic enablers. If you accept the point that we need to be able to act without the United States, we need our own air-to-air refueling capability, we need a satellite observation, satellite communication, etc. No single European country is going to build these alone, so both NATO and the EU have tried to stimulate Europeans to do it together. Does it work? NATO calls it smart defense, and a very senior American official responsible for smart defense once told me the only smart defense projects that really work are those that already existed before and that were retroactively rebaptized smart defense. But it doesn't really work, I think, because if the idea of smart defense is that Europeans should do more together, it goes a bit against the genetic code of NATO, where the point was always to prevent Europeans from teaming up. Because if they do, that will make it more difficult for the US Federal Marshal to control all these various local sheriffs. Does it work on the EU side? The EU called it pooling and sharing. And I like to make the point that actually pooling and sharing was there first, because you still have many people talking about the EU should not duplicate what NATO is already doing. Pooling and sharing was launched in December 2010, and because it seemed to be going somewhere, the then NATO Secretary Rasmussen, 2 months later, the Munich Security Conference of February 11, launched Smart Defense as his sort of reply to get his share of that market. I will not say that pooling and sharing really works. I would say it goes less difficultly than smart defense, because in the end it's a European problem that logically can be solved better in a place where Europeans sit around the table. and to decide how they want to cooperate. We kicked it up to the level of the European Council, head of state and government. We got some dynamic going. Projects are underway in 4 important areas: air-to-air refueling, satellite communication, cybersecurity, drones. But they're mostly in the stage of making better use of the existing capability by pooling it. But making better use of what you have still does not get you more. So this is what I mean with for a few dollars more. If more member states would pitch in, more member states need to take part and need to invest more, then we would be going somewhere. And these are really key areas. These are real strategic enablers that Europeans need. But these are 4 areas. Back in December 2011, the EU actually prioritized 11 areas, which did not include cybersecurity. So there's 8 more to be addressed. You know, when are we going to launch projects in those areas? That's another question. Third and final point, the Magnificent 7, or the Magnificent 2, or the Magnificent 28, or anything in between. Cooperation in clusters of European states. That's the other level of capability development. You have the big EU-wide projects almost. If you want to build a drone or a satellite, it will not be the Benelux countries that are going to do it. It will be 10, 12, 15 member states or more. But you also have these various regional clusters of integration. Now, a lot is happening there. There is a strong dynamic, a stronger dynamic at this level. But the question is it going anywhere, and is anybody coordinating it? I would say, I would encourage this if the countries who do it really choose for very radical pooling of efforts. Meaning, like the Belgian and Dutch navies have done, that you keep national platforms. You know, our navies are more or less integrated, but the ship either has a Belgian flag and a Belgian crew, or it has a Dutch flag and a Dutch crew. But everything behind the ships, headquarters, maintenance, logistics, training, is either merged. There's only one support function for the 2 countries, or the tasks have been divided. So one country does it for the 2. And national structures have been replaced, have been closed down. This is the way forward. There is no way that a country like Belgium, we're now debating whether or not to replace our F-16 aircraft with another aircraft. I've been getting all these emails from Lockheed Martin convincing me of the beauty of the F-35. You can see here a difference in strategic culture maybe. Lockheed Martin gave a PowerPoint presentation with coffee. Dassault, that produces the Rafael, gave a champagne reception at the French embassy. The Swedes, the Gripen, they came to my office, so I had to serve them coffee. But they're not really in the running, I think. So you have to go really far in this pooling and sharing. Even with aircraft, for example, you can very well imagine, I think, that Belgium buys X aircraft, the same as a neighboring country. Could buy the F-35 like the Netherlands, or the Rafale like the French. And we would have Belgian aircraft with Belgian flags on the tail, a Belgian pilot inside it. But it could be on a Dutch airbase. Maintenance, logistics, training, it could all be merged together. So this is, I think, the way forward. There is a dynamic. Also on the NATO side, there's a framework nation concept that Germany launched, which, if it would go this far, I think would be really useful. But already you find many different interpretations of it, and many people now seem to feel that the point of the framework nation groups is to provide rotations of the new, very high readiness joint task force that NATO has created by way of conventional deterrence in the East. If it's only that, then I'm not sure we need a framework nation concept for that. Conclusion, how the West was won or how the West was lost, we're still not quite sure, but it will definitely not be by everybody doing his own thing in his own corner. It will be by ever further reaching cooperation between Europeans. Will we end up with one European army? I would wish so, but I don't think so. We will end up with a very complex puzzle of some still national capabilities, of capabilities that are offered a few times, every time by a cluster of a few countries. Imagine a Belgian-Dutch Air Force, a Nordic Air Force, and a few others. And then of capabilities that are offered only once by a really big European-wide cluster. Think of these strategic enablers. And so all of this will require strong top-down coordination that can be provided by the European Union, reconciling the ambition of Europeans to be able to act autonomously without the United States, and inputting that into the NATO defense planning process to coordinate that also with our, of course, our ambition with regard to Article 5 and collective defense. Thank you very much.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to give a talk here, not only on the OSCE, as was promised in the program, but also about NATO, so you get that one for free. No extra costs attached. Because Joachim Kovers, my colleague from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, Free University of Brussels, and I wrote a paper about the EU's relationship with NATO and the OSCE. We wanted to talk about the relationship of the three organizations, because if you talk about the European security architecture or the European foreign and security architecture, as also my colleague showed in the first presentation, you have a variety of organizations, and you have to look at these organizations, each of them, to understand how European security is being constructed and also transformed. So in our case, we chose these three organizations. Arguably, we could also look at the Council of Europe, especially if you look at the human rights dimension of the EU. Then the Council of Europe would be quite logical also to make also to compare what the EU is doing with the Council of Europe. But we decided to stick to these three organizations. So why would you study these three organizations to begin with? First of all, in general, one can say that on a global scale, international organizations, international governmental organizations, but also non-governmental organizations, interact more closely. And this is a process which started arguably decades ago, but it has increased in the last 2 decades or so. It's connected to the idea of global governance or international organization. And to understand something about world politics, I think it's crucial to study the interaction of different international organizations. Within the context of the European Union, the EU's ever-growing relations with other IOs is one of the most dynamic subfields of the study of the EU. There have been quite some studies now about how the EU interacts with the UN, with the OSCE, with NATO, but also with the WTO, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Council of Europe, and so on and so forth. And it has really become a subfield with a specific literature trying to make sense of how the EU interacts with these organizations and what the results of these interactions are, and also, of course, how these interactions can be explained. Also, with this paper, we thought it also makes sense to look at the interaction between these international organizations in terms of understanding what effective multilateralism means. In 2003, when the EU came up with its security strategy, they launched the idea of effective multilateralism, meaning that through working with other international organizations, the EU could make a difference in world politics. So not only the EU would tackle global issues itself, but also strengthen, for example, other organizations tackling the same issues, supporting other international organizations, and then through these organizations make a difference. Effective multilateralism. There's much more to say about that. Actually, it's quite a vague concept, but this is, I think, the main meaning of what effective multilateralism is. So what did we do? We looked at the literature on the interaction of these three organizations, and we identified 4 main themes. The first theme is evolution and drivers, in the sense of the literature that studies the interaction of these institutions very much focuses on how these relations evolved in the light of the end of the Cold War. There we have it again. And everything what happened afterwards, of course. And also they try to make sense, okay, what are the main drivers that cause these relationships and can explain where we are right now. Another body of literature is looking at overlapping policy fields. All three organizations transformed in the 1990s. They are still transforming, hence our subtitle Caught in Transformation. They're constantly transforming. And one of the results of these transformations is that the policy fields became more overlapped. The third theme is partnership and rivalry. Arguably one can say that in any relationship between two IOs and also between IOs and NGOs, both are present. There is a dimension of partnership but also rivalry. Rivalry does not necessarily need to be bad, but it's often present. And finally, impact and effectiveness. And the latter, of course, is also important in terms of the effective multilateralism, because working together as international organizations within Europe, in the end, is meant to make better policy and to come up with better solutions. So there's also a wide body of literature out there studying the impact and effectiveness. Now let's go to the specific organizations. First, NATO. The relationship between EU and NATO only started in the 1990s. During the Cold War there was a clear division of labor. The EU was busy with economic integration. NATO did hard security, tried to keep the Soviets out. But in the 1990s, slowly but surely I would say, a relationship was born between both organizations. And by now one can say that it has become one of the most densely institutionalized relationships between two IOs. They interact quite a lot, not always in the right way, or not always on the formal level, but on the informal level, I will speak about that in a few minutes, there's quite some cooperation. More recently, if you look at the literature, there have been some serious concerns about the viability and effectiveness of this inter-organizational partnership, especially on the formal level. There have been some problems and therefore also concerns about the future of this relationship between EU and NATO. So let's have a look at the four themes and the EU-NATO relationship. If you look at the evolution and drivers, we see that the end of the Cold War came with an increase of actor density. A lot of actors became active in the European security framework. And functional overlap, especially because we had, and that is something that is mentioned in almost all of the literature, we had the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s, not only in Bosnia but also later in Kosovo in 1999. And according to most authors, this played a very important role in driving the two organizations together. They were both present in the Balkans in terms of field missions. They interacted therefore quite a lot. And it also stimulated cooperation on a formal level and the development of new institutions in the EU mainly. What also happened are overlapping policy fields in the 1990s. Both organizations increasingly dealt with crisis management, although not always exactly in the same way, but crisis management nonetheless. And one can say that is the key reason for increasing overlap between the EU, NATO, and also, by the way, the OSCE. And the EU's military ambitions, the decision to launch at the end of the 1990s mainly and afterwards to launch a serious security policy within the EU implied policy overlap with NATO. One can say a lot about that. On the one hand, one can say, listen, the EU does only do light security missions, whereas NATO do the more heavy security missions. But nonetheless, if you look at these operations in the Balkans, for example, then there's also quite some policy overlap in the field. Then cooperation and rivalry. Similarities in terms of policy aims, membership and policy tools led to close cooperation, but also to rivalry. This was also shown in the field in the Balkans, but also on the institutional level. It was if if you look at the overlapping policy fields, there is a core question behind that. What are the core tasks and what is the identity of this specific organization? And the crucial thing is that the identity and the core tasks of the organizations have been expanded in the 1990s. And that led to also concerns of rivalry and organizations accusing other organizations, EU accusing NATO and the other way around, that they did, that they carried out tasks that was not their original task to do. Impact and effectiveness, NATO influence on the EU and EU influence on NATO. There is quite some influence of NATO on the EU. If you look at the military and security structures within the EU, it has been inspired by NATO to a large extent. The other way around is much less obvious. There's weak EU coordination in NATO. Quite a few NATO member states don't want the EU to have a strong coordinated position. They want to have NATO as an open organization to do consultations, and I don't want to have the EU coming in with a strongly coordinated position. That's different in the OSCE, by the way. And then you can look at joint impact and effectiveness. And there are also, if you look at the literature, some concerns coupled to the concerns of cooperation and rivalry, that overall the impact of the cooperation could be much bigger if certain things would be changed. So also some concerns over there. Then we have the EU-OSCE relationship. These relations commenced much earlier, already in 1975, when the Helsinki Final Act was signed. The European Commission was there. The rotating presidency of the EU was there. And actually the EU involvement in the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, was considered to be the first test of the European political cooperation, which is a kind of proto-European foreign policy. Didn't really work out, but it's one of the first attempts to create a foreign policy. However, relations remained quite modest until the 1990s, when the Conference on the Security and Cooperation in Europe became the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And just like as with NATO, we arrive now at a moment that there are quite some concerns about rivalry between the EU and the OSCE, with the EU being the dominating partner and actually not taking the OSCE too serious. Looking at the four themes again, end of the Cold War, just like with NATO, overlap of membership, mandates and policy fields. Even more than with NATO, the EU created this security and defense policy that was new, that created overlap with NATO, but the EU's human rights and let's say soft security focus overlapped considerably with what the OSCE already was doing. Overlapping policy fields in terms of specific domains are conflict prevention, post-conflict rehabilitation, election monitoring and assistance, counter-terrorism, police issues, and so forth and so on. So in that sense, the EU and the OSCE can be considered as natural-born partners, which is a quote from Solana. And it's true to a certain extent. At the same time, since both organizations are in many ways pursuing a similar agenda, especially when it comes to human rights, there are also concerns of rivalry, as I said before. And the EU is sometimes accused of using the OSCE strategically, and that leads to concerns that the relationship or the partnership is not used at its best. So when we come to impact and effectiveness, the same conclusion as with NATO. The literature is quite pessimistic on the joint impact and effectiveness. At the same time, there are big differences when it comes to the EU influence on the OSCE. There's a strong influence. There are 28 EU member states, being also member state of the OSCE, which is 58 member states. So they dominate the agenda to a large extent. It is a consensus organization, so they cannot, force their ideas all the time on the organization. But if you are with 28 and you have a common position, you have a quite strong position. There's also some OSCE influence on the EU, but that is much more limited. So let me conclude with some thoughts. If you look at the literature and you consider these four themes, what is striking is that it all remains primarily at a pre-theoretical level. Authors look at these inter-organizational relationship and they say, listen, there's rivalry or there's cooperation, but they cannot really yet explain why it is there, at least not in theoretical terms. There's an emphasis on policy-oriented analysis, also on single case studies. We would need much more comparative work in that respect. And also quite a few normative and prescriptive think tank reports, which are very valuable. But if we want to go one step further and understand what is really going on in the relationship between these three organizations, we would need more theoretical work. And I think the approach that we present today is a good step into that direction, because you really position the EU as a specific type of actor within this European security and foreign policy framework. So we need a systemic theoretical exploration of the conditions under which the three IOs cooperate, compete and relate to each other. Okay, I will leave it by there. Thank you.
Okay, at this point I'd like to turn it over to Rafael Biermann, who has the first task of being the first discussant, and we'll discuss everything, I suppose.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, thanks for being here. I was invited very shortly. I'm in St. Edwards today and giving a presentation on secession in international politics, Ukraine and so on. But nevertheless, now I'm here, and so I'm asked to discuss two of the papers, the last two papers, and I start with the last one because you have this in mind still, I guess, mostly. First of all, this is my special topic, inter-organizational relations, so I know quite a lot, I think, about it, and I know the literature, and I think it's a very good overview of the literature. I think it really very well summarizes the state of the art on both EU-OSCE and EU-NATO relations. It's in good shape, I think. It has a good grab on the literature. So what I do is just give some further recommendations of how to improve the paper. First, my question is, why do you select those two? You could select others, but you don't explain why you take those two. I mean, the EU is really, as the first presentation also pointed out, the one organization that is most densely linked with other organizations, including IMF, UNHCR, and whatever. So I think it would be good just to explain why they take those two, and maybe also in terms of comparison, do a kind of a systematic comparison between those two, because there are very interesting points on comparing those two. I will mention 2 or 3 points here. You have 4 different criteria that you look at. I would like to have a 5th one, and this is institutional design. I think we have almost no literature on institutional design among concerning inter-organizational relations, and I think there is a strong need. I was just writing a paper on the consensus principle and its effects on policy for these organizations, and I think there is something to say, for example, about what kind of agreements do we have between these organizations. We have Berlin Plus and so on. What are the coordinating mechanisms? Which levels, different levels do we have of coordination? Maybe even more interesting, what's the degree of formalization? You talked about NATO and EU, almost everything informal at the moment, or between EU, OSCE, highly formalized already since the 1970s, if you want so. The idea of an EU caucus within OSCE that we have since the 70s, but which NATO does not want to have within NATO as concerns the EU. So many things that are highly political, I think, to look at. The next point is you put together effectiveness and impact, and I think those are two very different things. Impact, when you talk about impact, you mean emulation, imitation. One imitating the other, and yet there is some literature about especially the EU imitating NATO concerning its institutional structure. The whole institutional structure created in 1999 is very similar to NATO, and obviously there is what we call isomorphism here between the organizations. But I think there is more if you look at effectiveness, and my problem is effectiveness. We have almost no literature on effectiveness. Especially, and you in the first presentation already said, okay, let's be careful about effectiveness. But I think we need to think seriously, and this is true for the whole IR literature, I think, on about effectiveness. And especially the Europeans have to be more serious about effectiveness. So how effective, what is the added value of this kind of cooperation? Does it really help solve collective action problems, like piracy in the Gulf and so on? Or is it mainly, and this is what legitimacy research talks about, is it mainly a facade? Decoupling rhetoric from reality. Meyer and Rowan, 1977 already talked about this. And I think there is a lot of facade in this kind of politics. And when we talk about effectiveness, we have to talk about criteria of effectiveness. What are our criteria? Because people differ widely about what is effective or not effective. So in your paper you say, well, the EU operations, the first 2 EU operations with NATO were effective. Yeah? And you cite the literature. I'm not sure. If you take Concordia, for example, which was the Macedonia case, the first cooperation, the French reaction was totally negative. The French said, this is not working. And their criterion was, it restricts far too much the EU's autonomy. Because of the command structure, the joint command structure that we have. We don't like this. And this is, I think, one of the major reasons why we don't have any more Berlin Plus operations. It's not just Cyprus, but it's also France and others saying, well, we want to have autonomous operations, and we don't want to be restricted in our autonomy by working together with NATO and the SACEUR, DSACEUR and others saying us what to do, or Naples. So effectiveness, I think, is very important. We need much more research on this, and I would also, I'm not going into the detail, I would also challenge you what you say about Althea and effectiveness there. Just look at the literature, the article of Kupferschmidt, who has been in these operations. He is quite different on this. Next point, EU-NATO. I would more clearly divide phases of cooperation or non-cooperation between organizations. You start doing this, but I think it could be more systematic for both diets. And again, I'm more skeptical. You says you have 4 different phases, I agree, but the first phase, for example, is the 1990s, before ESDP. Before ESDP started in 1999. And you say, well, this is very much a first phase of attempting coordination, and that's it. And I would say, no, this is a phase where there was serious rivalry already among the organizations concerning the future of the West European Union. And the West European Union was a very big question mark. Where would it go? Would it go to EU or to NATO? Big topic, I don't want to get into the details. Second phase, again, I would say, you say it's more or less constructive cooperation, you say, in the second phase between 1999 and 2004. And I would say this is the phase where they tried to negotiate Berlin Plus. It took 4 years. It was extremely agonizing, very frustrating. First the US blocked, then the French blocked, then Cyprus blocked. Several blocking, and many people say, well, this was not a very good experience. Yeah. So again, I would be a little bit more careful. And what do we see today? I would say, yes, we have informalization. Why do we have informalization? Because we have a breakdown of formal cooperation. We have a breakdown, and not only because of Cyprus, but because the other allies like it like this. And the Europeans like it like this. They are satisfied. They can live with this situation. Next point, OSCE. I think it's well drafted, but I want to mention 2 aspects, or 3 that you don't mention. First is FERA. I think we can only understand OSCE-EU relations if you look at FERA, and FERA is in 2000, 1 year after creating ESDP. In FERA, they created the civilian part of ESDP. And so the civilian part of ESDP, civilian missions, and most of the missions of the EU are civilian missions, are a huge challenge for OSCE, because OSCE was preparing for years to do civilian missions. And now EU comes without asking OSCE and pushes aside OSCE and does the same, actually. And so OSCE is marginalized and has to find a niche, if you want so. So the second point is, and if you talk with people over there, they talk about encroachment, infringement, and all this stuff. Second, look at Russia. I mean, if you want to understand OSCE-NATO relations, Russia plays a huge role. It is blocked because of Russia blocking OSCE. And I think there is a serious problem here also with EU-OSCE relations, especially concerning the so-called human dimension of the OSCE. The human dimension of the OSCE is what Russia really does not like and what it is blocking, and this also concerns EU-OSCE relations. And I would look more closely at Ukraine at the present, because I think OSCE-EU relations are very interesting at this point of time, as OSCE is deployed there, as EU might be deployed there, and as EU is negotiating in parallel to the OSCE. So very interesting to see the dynamics there, and I don't know the details. I think if you want to change NATO-EU relations and maybe also EU-OSCE relations, you need a big shock that changes the relationship. I don't see it at the moment, but this is the only thing. Also, if you look back at other interorganizational relations, shocks are the ones that change the path of cooperation or non-cooperation. Last point here. I think especially EU-NATO relations are far below their potential. They could be much better. And my main point, which you do not or hardly discuss, is that there is a huge track of non-cooperation on policy issues where there should be cooperation. Take enlargement, big issue. Take Mediterranean cooperation. There's almost no cooperation. Take energy. Take capacity building of the African Union. In 2006, NATO Secretary General talked about demarcation between EU and NATO. And I think there is still a lot of demarcation between them. Okay, so this is the first paper. My remarks a little bit more critical than it's in the paper, but otherwise I like it. I'm working closely together with one of the authors. Second point for Scen, Biscop. This is a very policy-oriented paper, totally different from the other one. So you've got to see how you combine those, of course. I mean, I think it's not possible in one volume, I would say. It is very competent. Scen Biscop is always very competent. All the papers I read are very well drafted, very innovative also. Still, I have some major problems. The first is linking back to your paper, the first paper that you gave. You are talking about the EU as a hub organization in network theory. We talk about hub or linking pin organizations. And I think this is a good portrait, I would say. But the way Scen Biscop is portraying is, for me, a little bit going back to 1999 NATO-EU relations and the question who has primacy in there. And the primacy issue is a little bit different, because if you talk about who is the default platform, so who should be the first to be asked? This reminds me of discussions we had in 1999 following. Yeah? The institution of first choice. And this is different from being a hub organization, because a hub organization is coordinating with the others, is a coordinating agent, and is, if you want so, serving the others. Yeah? Is EU serving the others? I'm not sure about this. So coming to your paper, I think the central argument is well taken. In between your paper, you find a lot of buts. But there is a huge gap between reality and rhetoric. But we see a lot of further cuts, defense cuts in Great Britain and France. But there's very little substantial cooperation on multilateral capabilities projects. But in Mali and in Libya, not the EU was acting, but NATO was acting. But there is an intervention fatigue, but there is a lack of unity, and so on. Yeah? So a lot of small buts in between. Now my problem is a little bit more fundamental, and I would like to look a little bit, if you want so, behind the scenes. What's my problem? I think my problem is that you too quickly go on saying, well, there is a new division of labor, and now we start talking about the EU. And I think we have to look back at NATO-EU relations to understand how this is and what the problems are with this new division of labor you are talking about. I would say in 1999, when ESDP, CSDP was created, we created a situation, a scenario of institutional choice. Very comfortable for European states, because you can choose between EU, between NATO, between OSCE, and so on. It's a redundancy situation. And we all like redundancy situations. However, on the other hand, such a situation also breeds rivalry, of course. Because you can choose, and the organizations always ask, do they take me or do they take the other? And especially in a situation where institutional preferences and cultures diverge between EU and NATO, this is a serious problem, especially cultures. Because the choice impacts the relevance of the individual organization, if you want the survival. And the choice impacts the resource endowment. Who gets what? How much resources does any of the organizations get? And you see how OSCE and how Council of Europe are suffering because they don't get the resources anymore they got before once the EU came in place. And this is what especially I think in NATO people are thinking about, the relative relevance in a system of overlapping responsibilities. And I think this is not conducive for a harmonious division of labor, and it creates duplication. It invites duplication. Second, if you look empirically at interorganizational relations, you rarely see division of labor. It doesn't work. Normally, what you have is kind of a very ambiguous situation. There is actually only one case where I know there is a serious and explicit division of labor, and that was in Georgia between UN and OSCE up to 2008, the Georgia War. Third, there is a trend in this relationship, and the trend can be captured by what the first paper talked about, EU autonomization. There is a process of increasing autonomy of the European Union. They have successfully established the CSDP. They have, I would say, pushed aside other organizations like OSCE and the Council of Europe. The West European Union is dissolved. The Lisbon Treaty has established a collective assistance clause. We have, they have aspired for an own headquarter, and I would say they are climbing up the Petersburg ladder, which is the Petersburg tasks. They are climbing up slowly in this direction. So what remains for NATO after Afghanistan? Collective defense. This is not visible. This is not something you can show. This is not something you have on your card. Large-scale operations, which ones? And if you look from a point of view of Europe, there is the good cop and the bad cop. There is the good cop, which is the EU, and it portrays itself as the good cop, multilateralism. And there is the bad cop, which is NATO. And I think this is an unproductive image problem between both, and an unproductive division of labor. And I think the deadlock between EU and NATO has a lot to do with not only Turkey, but with the scope problem, as David Joost would say, between those two organizations. Who is doing what? And I think there is no easy division of labor between both. Finally, coming to the United States, since we are here. The United States has the problem, and the problem is that it's only in NATO but not in the European Union. So the natural partner for the US is NATO, not the European Union, first of all. So what did you do? The new division of labor, Sven Biscop talks about, requires the US to let go, to let the Europeans do the job, like, for example, now in Ukraine. But if, as you say, the EU is failing in one scenario, what's the EU, what's NATO, what's the US doing? Two options. One option is, let them do the job, we'll sit back and relax. That's not what the US does normally. They begin talking about weapons, sending weapons to the Ukrainians. Yeah? And what did they do in Bosnia? They talked about lift and strike, the same. Well, if you don't manage solving the problem, we get in and we send weapons ourselves to the Bosniaks at that point of time. So burden sharing is dual-edged. It relieves the US from the burdens of doing it themselves. But on the other hand, it implies a loss of control and influence. And my experience is that the US is not willing to allow a loss of control, being this dominant superpower, especially if serious interests come up. Washington would like to have it both ways, my experience. They like to have it both ways. Okay, give up the burden, but no responsibility. Let them do the task, but not the responsibility. Don't give them responsibility. And now I could give you a lot of examples of this in my studies, and I maybe just give you two. One is take Bosnia, the High Representative over there. Civilian implementation of Dayton, not important. Let the Europeans do this. We do the military implementation, I4, S4, and so on. What happened? Americans realized civil implementation became more and more important. They needed to see that this is successful. And from their point of view, it was not successful, the first 2 years especially. So what did they do? They built up the embassy in Sarajevo to become bigger than the staff of the High Representative. And I was in Bosnia, and I experienced how this is if an American comes in and we have to get out. Yeah, that's the way it is then. Okay. And you could talk about the European Conference on former Yugoslavia, where the same thing took place. Look at the way how Dayton was managed. Look at the police in Afghanistan. Yeah, very dissatisfied with the Germans for good reasons. Very dissatisfied afterwards with the Europeans for good reasons. And then the Americans take over. Yeah? So there is this kind of haggling, if you want, so pushing and shoving between those two. And I think if we talk about the EU taking over and a new division of labor, I would say we have to talk about those things. This is very fragile. There is a story behind the story. And we need to think about what does it mean, especially for NATO, and what is the US view really on those things? What do they really want? Are they willing to go this way? Or what are the US interests? Now, the Ukraine might be a game changer at the end. It might be, because this is a scenario which is a shock at least for the Europeans. And I see that especially the security culture in Europe is shifting here, especially in Germany. Very interesting to see. Maybe we talk in the discussion about it. So this might be a point where security culture in the more pacifist countries is moving closer to the security culture in the US, and therefore bringing both institutions closer to one another and increasing the chances that some of the deadlock within the European Union, for example, on pooling and sharing, might be overcome. Okay, thank you.
And now our first practitioner.
Just stand here.
Yeah.
I already learned a lot from the comments so far, and I want to say that the last comment from Mr. Biermann, I think, was very illuminating in many ways. Not least what you just said about the American position. I had a former American colleague who was an ambassador, US ambassador, who used to say to me, "We tell, you pay." And I don't think that's gold. I still, to a certain extent, it is there. You also mentioned that we haven't really gone through the issue of effectiveness and impact. I'm just myself tried to spend the last 3 years to write a book about that for the EU on security, which is coming out soon. And I found over 20 different areas where we have problems of impact and effectiveness in the EU, which I think we all have to go through in order to deal with them. I agree with your comment also about the incompatibility of the papers to a certain extent. Clearly, Scen has put forward a prescriptive paper, whereas the others are much more sort of a little bit less more trying to establish the state of play in science. I have a major problem with the papers, except possibly the first one. when it comes to the vision of the organization, what they are. I think you mentioned several times the key missing point here. There are actually two missing points. First, I cannot, after having worked in and with these organizations now for 30 years, talk about them without taking as the point of departure the member states of the organizations. They are developing the vision, the strategies. They are using the organizations, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly through others, like the EU. If you don't understand that, I don't think you can understand how the institutional architecture has developed. I give you a case in point. Niels, you mentioned that there is no vision in the EU for the OSCE. Well, I can tell you that I spent 4 years in the 90s in a group led by Alison Bales and some other people who were the security policy directors of the member states of the European Union, who developed a document which is called the Platform for Cooperative Security, which became an important part of the outcome of the Istanbul Summit in 1999, which contained a very clear vision how the different organizations in Europe should relate to each other, how they should form what NATO called this mutually complementary and reinforcing relationship, which Rothfeld, of course, called the inter-blocking organizations because he saw the reality. But there was a clear vision from the EU side what should happen with these. The second type of vision, which has not been mentioned at all, I think, in any of the papers really clearly, is the Russian vision. The Russian vision, which has been explained to me by my Russian colleagues over the years, have been developed in the literature and the scientific literature, which is not quoted here, namely by Zagorsky and all the Russian scholars in Moscow, which are talking about different systems of integration. The fact that the EU and NATO have actually taken control over the OSCE to promote a system of integration based on values and commitments to which the Russians no longer really subscribe. They were forced to subscribe to these values and commitments towards the end of the Cold War at the Paris Summit in 1990, and the Moscow mechanism and so on, but they don't think they are realistic anymore. Now, how do NATO and the EU do this? Well, they do it not, and here is the issue is not cooperation between the organization, it's the organic parallel work of these organizations in their outreach to the neighborhood. Through MAP discussions, through enlargement, through neighborhood policies, European partnership and what have you. Almost nothing of this is in these papers. Which I see, I mean, the whole thing about the power of attraction of the European Union, what Herman van Rompuy said at Munich 1 or 2 years ago, remember that the power of attraction of the European Union is the access to the internal market. That's the real thing. It's not crisis management we are talking about here, or conflict prevention missions. It's a fundamental possibility to come closer to a better life. And the same thing as regards NATO, of course, that if you can establish more security, then you also have a better chance to get closer to the EU. Vice versa, if you have more rule of law, better economy, then you also have better conditions to get closer to NATO. This whole organic parallel relationship, for which also the OSCE is used by its member states, is almost totally absent from the papers. So for me, this is a major problem, because it also means that when you talk about crisis management as a scope of the discussion, you miss the whole community part of the discussion. Enlargement, neighborhood, trade, all these big community policy areas which really are central for the countries in the East, if we now talk about the overseas area. So either you do a delimitation of the discussion to certain aspects of the relationship between the different organizations, or you introduce this perspective, perhaps with an additional paper in the beginning or whatever. I think it's definitely is necessary, because if you don't have this, the member state perspective working with and through the organizations, then you don't also understand what you are talking about, namely the catalytic thing, which is one of my main points in my book, namely that the EU can enable, restrict, and encourage and persuade soft power, so lots of things, and it can of course do it through the other organizations as well, through the United Nations, through the Council of Europe, through the OSCE. Here I also want to point to the unique capability of the European Union, namely the European Council. And this relates a little bit to the time perspective in the papers. I think you have to make a much clearer distinction in time. Much of the literature references you have are from the period before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. We have discussed in David Spence's book together, hopefully coming out this summer now I hear, the work on the External Action Service. We try to contrast in a number of different articles coming out on Paul Gray, before and after the Lisbon Treaty. Very little literature out on the situation after the Lisbon Treaty entry into force. But there are fundamental developments after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty that I would like to mention. Not just the epistemic communities which are developing, but an enormous capability on the level of the European Council to deal with crisis management in continuous mode, across the pillars. Followed up now by Juncker, doing what Barroso didn't dare to do, namely to establish the clusters. Again, re-establish the clusters now with what Solana couldn't be, namely to include Mogherini. I mean, this is enormous capability of discussing grand strategy, and namely to do what Lawrence Friedman talks about in his book now on strategy, namely to correlate objectives with resources, which we've never done properly in the CSDP, but which has been done consistently, I think, in the community areas over many years, and where the European Council has said we have, at short intervals, we might have to pull out €1 billion for this. Several billion euros. Just in a few weeks, you get billions on the table. Now, how can you imagine that you do that through the intergovernmental decision-making machinery in the EU? It doesn't work. So maybe we are in for a game changer here, that if we really have to respond to serious crisis, as we're now doing with Ebola and other things, that the European Council will learn how to do that also for internal, external aspects of security, countering radicalization on terrorism, etc., etc. This is maybe a new situation for European security, which makes much of the earlier discussion less relevant for the future. So this means that when I look at Sven's paper, I think Mr. Biermann said, your first name is what?
Rafael.
Rafael. When you speak about where are we on EU CSDP versus NATO, I am as a Swede, I see a big problem for the time being. I see that there is a disconnect in the national debates on defense. In the northern part of Europe, we have now a preoccupation with territorial defense, going back to national defense concerns. People are talking much more about NATO, and people are talking about the UN. If we are going to have important peacekeeping or peace support operations in Africa, we may have to do it through the UN. We need to. So there you come back to capabilities, rather the EU trying to catalyze more capability generation on the level of member states, which will not maybe be used in the EU or through the EU, but which may be used through other organizations or other setups, ranging from Swedish-Finnish defense cooperation to other formats. So I otherwise have much sympathy for the arguments that Scen put forward in his paper, but I think in order to convince the skeptics, I think one has to make the argument that on the one hand we are talking about a generic capability improvement of the member states of the European Union. That's what we need to do through the EU. And there, I don't know if you have noted, but there is an important and interesting, for me, as a former Commission official, have you seen that Juncker has just appointed Michel Barnier as his special representative for defense? This is actually coming to something which we have been discussing, and I will end this on Sven's paper with an example. In 2002, I was a Sherpa for Chris Patton in a study on the aerospace industry, which was called Star 21. It was the heads of EADS, British Aerospace, Finmeccanica, etc., together with Pascal Lamy, Chris Patton, Günther Verheugen for industry, Busquin for research, and Solana for CF, discussing the future of aerospace. And what these Lagardère and Enders and others were saying, forget about the notion of defense industry. There's no such thing. We're an industry. And forget the notion that we are European. We're not European. We are global. We are multinational companies. We are talking about an integrated civil military, defense, and civilian production. Goes together. We need a level playing field in the United States. So research has to, be global. So of course this was community. 90% of these questions were community issues. Had to be tackled through the trade commissioner in the negotiations with the United States on the trade agreements. And still for a long time we were blocked in the EU with the EDA concept, which got no money, was built on pure, So we will see now what happens. Of course, I think Barrett will tell us about hesitations to go commission, so to say, in the EU on security. But I'm convinced that if there is a real crisis on capabilities, if only Scen is half true on what the Americans are going to do towards Asia, then we might be forced to do much more in terms of generating more effectiveness. After all, we are spending about half of the money the Americans spend on defense, I think, something like that. And do we get 5% or 10% of the effectiveness? I don't know. Finally, on the OSCE paper, NATO, I will focus on the OSCE part of it in the relationship to. So what I miss there is some of the scientific literature. The one which is produced by people like Kohr in Hamburg, Zellner and others, the people who have been working on the security community concept in various contexts, not only think tanks, but also peer-reviewed papers. Those who have been developing general literature on the OSCE, like Gebali in Switzerland, which goes a bit further, closer to the practitioner perspective. Those who discuss first what is the role of the overseer in the overall system, what is the key purpose, so to say, of the organization, and how is it, and there you say that it's being used by the EU. You can equally say that the member states or the participating states of the OSCE have made sure that there are certain commitments in the OSCE that have been agreed by all participating states. And these commitments are supposed to be implemented. And the OSCE uses the EU as a leverage to get that done. Because the EU has actually translated some of the political commitments in the OSCE into legally binding commitment in its partnership and cooperation agreements with a number of countries in the OSCE region. So it goes both ways. And I would come back to the member states' perspective here. Because we have had a political coordination in the OSCE which has preceded almost CFSP. What we can see a daily or almost at least weekly, but twice weekly during my period in Vienna. I've served as head of the Commission delegation and then ES delegation in Vienna for altogether 8 years, from 96 to 2011, with a break of 7 years. And it's been a fantastic coordination, where we in every detail have developed an idea of what the OSCE should do, of course. But we have also worked on the premise that the commitments in the OSCE should be respected and implemented. And you note perhaps that the Astana summit in 2010 actually reaffirmed the whole body of OSCE and CSE commitments since 1975. The whole body. And this was done in a setting which, for people interested in the institutional setup of the EU, was very interesting. So the EU ambassadors in Vienna, collectively, the member states together with me, put forward a proposal to the Political and Security Committee, which was presented by the political director of the External Action Service, Helga Schmid, to the Political and Security Committee. PSE came up with a recommendation to restrict the number of priorities to this, and that is for the Astana summit. Goes back to Vienna, redone, goes back to the Foreign Affairs Council, noted as priorities for the EU for the Astana summit, put forward, negotiated by Ashton in an informal ministerial in Almaty, put forward as the EU joint position by Van Rompuy in Astana, speaking before all the other EU heads of state and government. Certainly something completely different from what we have seen before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. You don't mention this at all. I think it's a fundamental development of the capabilities of the EU to work with the OSCE. And if you go back to the Russian, that's my last point. If you go back to the Russian, the last word I had from my Russian colleague when I left Vienna, he's still the Russian ambassador in the OSCE, says, we have to agree on how we pursue the two systems of integration in the OSCE area. This is not good for us. So they see much more vision, coordination, and interaction between the organizations than we do ourselves. And I think they are right. I think we are much more influential than we believe, than what we see ourselves. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you, presenters, commentators. That is a great start to the day. What we're going to do now is open it up for both a response from our paper givers and an audience participation. We can actually push this back a bit. We don't have to end at 10:30, even though it says on the schedule we will. We'll see how it goes. We're flexible with respect to some time here. So I'm going to let Lawrence respond briefly. Ours was the overview paper, not a lot of need to respond directly. And then we'll allow Scen and Niels to really get into the responses.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna actually just pass on that just to give other people more time to respond. So, do you want to respond to a couple of points, Sven, and then Niels, and then we'll open up to the floor, or do you want to go straight to questions?
Let me just make one quick point then maybe. I think in a way there's two levels of division of labor. The division of labor I was talking about. One is between the United States and Europeans, whatever that may mean. And where the trend seems to be that the United States expect Europeans to do more. I fully agree that there's always somewhere, between the lines the expectation that we will do more when the United States decides that we ought to do more. And we will see to which extent there is a willingness to really let go. But you gave examples, you can find examples in the opposite direction as well, which probably just prove that they don't really know yet themselves. And obviously if Europeans fail to live up to expectations and the Americans feel that their interests are at stake, they will act. Which just, I think, reinforces the point that we better get our act together then, which has to start with strategic reflection. Then comes in the second division of level of division of labor. Among the Europeans then, which organizations do we use to do this? And there you have NATO, the EU, and the member states. And my point is rather that I don't plead for any sort of formalization of this. I just think that we have one security architecture that comprises these three, and that the trend is that some of its functions are shifting from one dimension to another, and that we should not become theological about it and just make sure that each task is done where it's done the most effectively and efficiently. My view is that strategizing overall and strategizing in crisis management would be better done at the EU. That's what I advocate. Building capabilities would be better done through the EU. Conducting military operations will in many cases be better done still through NATO because of the command structure. Organizing maneuvers will probably be better than through NATO because you have the command structure. So de facto there is some new division of labor emerging there, I would say. So who has primacy depends on the task at hand, I would say. But for me, the one that ought to have primacy when it comes to strategizing is the EU. Doesn't mean on each and every topic, though, that I think we need to have an EU strategy that would be that would be counterproductive as well. It depends on where you have really added value. That's my point. Didn't bring in the OSCE or the Russian perspective because I didn't think that was part of my remit. I do think I start from the member states' perspective because we are an intergovernmental area mostly, even on the EU side, and it doesn't work because member states far too often still, as a matter of default, take a national perspective, not even a NATO perspective. They just take a national perspective rather than anything else. And I mentioned actually somewhere, but I don't really elaborate upon it, the idea that I agree very much, Lars-Erik, that we should use the Commission, bringing the Commission into capability development, because especially all the enablers that we're lacking are dual use. And I agree very much that we should not focus too much on just defense industry. We should focus on European industry. We should somehow keep a European base, even that is then integrated with American companies, okay, but we do want to keep some of it under your control in Europe.
All right, Niels?
Yes, thanks a lot for the extensive and very elaborate feedback by both of you. I cannot go into all the points, but let me just select a few of them. Starting with the comments made by Lars-Erik Lundin. About the member state, I think that is a very good thing you said. However, the problem is a little bit that we review the literature as it is, right? And as you said rightly so, there's very little on member states. So that's why there's very little in our paper on the member states also, because it is not really mentioned a lot in the literature. But it would be a good thing to come back to this issue in our conclusion and identifying that as one of the missing things in the entire study of the relationships between EU, NATO, and the OSCE. About the question why just to go back to the first commentator, why NATO and OSCE and not, I don't know, IMF or UN or, well, it's just I guess it fits better the theme of this workshop, obviously. And I think if you're talking about European security, of course the UN is also one of the very important actor, and also the Council of Europe. But if we look at the literature, then there's quite a lot on EU interaction with these two organizations, and sometimes you just have to make a choice. So we focused on these two organizations because it is interesting enough, and I think by studying NATO, OSCE and EU relations, we can just learn a lot about cooperation between international organizations in general. About the fifth theme, Rafael, you were suggesting institutional design. I thought we kind of tackled that in the theme on evolution and drivers, but I guess you want to see more on specific literature.
Coordinating mechanisms,
Yeah.
formalization, density of ties,
Okay.
kind of the categories of network theory.
Because we talked about this and we indeed said, well, institutional design would fit this category, but I guess that in the end it did not, we don't speak a lot about institutional design per se, so it might be useful indeed to come up with an extra category. Going back to Lars-Erik, yes, the Russian vision, I think it's very important in understanding OSCE and also interactions between the EU and the OSCE and EU, NATO and so forth and so on. But again, it's on the level of a member state, and it is more or less lacking in the literature. And obviously that is a big omission, because if you look at interorganizational interaction literature, it leaves out the member states, also Russia as the big partner to the east, which of course dominates the environment of the OSCE, but also the EU. So it would also be good to say something about that in the conclusion. Okay, I will leave it by here for now.
Great. Okay. Thank you both for the responses. I'd like to open it up for questions, comments, cries of outrage from the audience. We'll start with whomever. Please, Maya.
Thank you very much for these great presentations and helpful comments and everything. It's really enjoyable to listen to. I guess my question is kind of getting into thinking about how my chapter fits with your presentation of your framework article. When you distinguish between these alternate visions and you talk about kind of soft and hard and the nature of where the EU falls in trying to pursue these various foreign policy initiatives, I'm wondering if you do see this as a kind of form of smart power, in that sense that this concept kind of implies the efficient coordination or combination, the strategic combination of those two kinds of approaches. Or in this architecture vision, you view it as a completely different kind of animal, or I'm just wondering whether the comprehensive approach, for example, in your mind, is about smart power, just getting into this architecture of it.
Yeah, well, I think I can sort of speak quickly on that one. Smart power, as you've heard the WAG say, is neither smart nor powerful, right? And it implies that there is some sort of coordinated action. Yeah. And architecture as a metaphor is something entirely different. It isn't necessarily, it is organic in many respects, right? Anything postmodern architecture or modern, sort of any of these sorts of things, right? So I think the reason we set it on the architecture framework, and that's not ours, I wish I could say that it was my invention, but it's been around for a very long time, is this notion that it's the interrelationship among the actors. Whether or not that is actual, whether or not it implies coordination purposeful coordination is almost, I mean, it's a nice to have, for sure. But with respect to, you can have an architecture that is completely uncoordinated. That is problematic in many ways, but it isn't necessarily sort of default, it isn't necessary for the architecture to exist. It would be nice if the comprehensive approach actually were an example of smart power. I don't yet think it is. I don't think at a comprehensive level, at a holistic European level, you heard from each of the presenters and not just ours. We've got so much, we could use the word rivalry, we could use the word overlap, we could use the word redundancy, that smart is very far down the road. Bert.
Well, I'm first of all, thanks. I'm slightly overwhelmed, I have to say, but perhaps I'm not the only one. I was rather happy that Lars-Erik mentioned that the member states, indeed, as a sort of a central element in all of this. And in your whole slide of catalyst, one wonders whether we should not put the EU/member states. That member states will look at this differently. Some of them will indeed, go for the EU as a default option, but others will, a bit as Sven said, just sit back, look at a problem, and say, well, through which channel shall we act? It depends a bit on how they relate to the EU as a political project. Yeah. When you say member states, you say membership, and there again we have to be very clear in what we are talking about. The EU is the 28 member states. NATO is many of these member states with the US. The US, which supplies 75% of the military capabilities, and clearly has a bit of a leading role in that organization. The OSCE, you add to that the Russians in a completely consensus-based. If you look at the EU and the OSCE, I mean, the Brichon-Beau, the former Secretary General, always said, I mean, the annual budget of the OSCE is 200 million euros, I think. That's the cost of moving the European Parliament back and forth between Brussels and Strasbourg. Yeah, I mean, but that's what we're talking about. So the OSCE is what? It's 200 million euros with the Russians. And so, I mean, if you start, there's many of these basic elements that I think we need to compare also. Look at the crisis that we face now today. I ask you, what is the key negotiating format? We talk a lot about this negotiating format. So it is not the Geneva format, which is, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the EU, the US. The key format is what is called the Normandy format. And that is the Germans, the French, again the Russians, and the Ukrainians. And then you look at all the dimensions of the conflict. Some of them are military, kinetic military. Some of them are security sector reform related. There is the macro-financial, there is the whole trade side, there is the electoral monitoring, there is the reform, there is the constitutional reform, etc. And member states will look at these various organizations then as platforms that they can use to implement certain elements. But I mean, the central role of member states is perhaps what one would expect from a member state diplomat, even though it's about to say. The one thing, and I come to my question now, this is a comment. Can one disagree with the discussants during an academic seminar? I suppose. I mean, the one thing I most strongly disagree with was this characterization. I'm not saying this because I'm sitting next to Rick, of the EU-NATO relationship as a breakdown. That totally does not correspond with the day-to-day reality, and it misses a few fundamental elements. Well, I mean, the formal is very much the tip of the iceberg. The day-to-day reality is that we cooperate very closely. When NATO was invited by the Libyans, the first thing we did was pick up the phone and said, come and speak to us, because we've been trying to create a mission in Libya for 2 years, and we did share the information. NATO sees documents before some of our member states. I think it misses, no, it's true, I think it misses one, the structural element of France returning to the NATO military structures. That clearly has signaled a shift in the relationship. And also a sort of the element of the consistency that the ES has brought. I mean, I used to co-chair the EU-NATO capability group, which is not a pastime I recommend. But you had a 6-month rotating presidency. And every 6 months, on the NATO side it was one guy chairing it, on the EU side it was 6 months, it was one of the member states. It was very formal, etc. And every 6 months he interrupted the change on the EU side. But now, I mean, it's the same guy all along. I mean, it's not me anymore, someone else now. So anyway, that's the only thing that I heard, but I really quite strongly disagreed and would like to flag that, well, the literature, even though the literature may say that, well, it's wrong, or it's out of date, please. Yeah, this leads to my question. Define the ideal EU-NATO relationship, please.
Let me then continue on.
We'll do a follow-on and then we'll have a response on this. And then we'll go.
I think a lot of this, in listening to the three major presentations, really depends what stool you're sitting on, your perspective of how you see the organizations and how you see the coordination. I agree completely with Bernd on the coordination, probably at the level that matters, which is the preparation. The organizations, there are two aspects of the organizations. One is the member states. They're the same, and interestingly, sometimes the same nations don't have the same views in different organizations. The other is the organizations themselves have a personality. They start with, in our case, the Secretary General and his staff. In the EU, the three-headed leadership, which makes it an interesting dynamic in itself. And then on the OSCE, the way that they run there. So the organizations and the staffs take on a certain piece and they can drive, but in the end, the people that pay and the people that decide are the nations. And consensus is it's terrible, but when it works probably better than others, having things work down on. The NATO, OSCE, NATO-EU relationship, NATO-UN relationship, NATO-African Union relationship are all there. They vary in how we coordinate. Again, largely at the staff, starting from the Secretary General and the head of the other organization down. The staffs on the military side, I find the relationship on the military side, or the practical in the field, excellent. Be it counter-piracy, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Kosovo, even while we were doing the operation in Libya. Very, very good cooperation. A lot of the difficulties, the farther you get away from Brussels, I think the easier it is to cooperate. And I think how to build on that, make sure whatever we decide in Brussels or Brussels and Vienna, don't interfere with those good things that work, which is absolutely key. I'll end there.
Yeah, we'll take the last question and then back.
So thank you very much. And my question is for Dr. Biscop. You said several times in your presentation that the European Union and not the North Atlantic Council is the right place for formulating grand strategy and for strategizing. But you didn't explain, at least that I heard, why you think so. And with respect, I'd like to say why I doubt that it can serve that function, and then please invite you and encourage you to explain to me why I'm wrong. It seems to me that the North Atlantic Council was the forum that was originally formulated with the purpose in mind of enshrining and defining and institutionalizing the grand strategy of the victorious power, at least the Western victorious powers after World War II. The European Union was not formulated with that purpose in mind, and I would have thought that if anybody would come to supplant it, to supplant the role of the NATO Council, it would be something like the G7, which actually encompasses a group of powers with the right interests in alignment and with the requisite means to accomplish their objectives, and then have bodies like the EU and even the OSCE, perhaps, and even the United Nations ratify the basic elements of the grand strategy. But it seems to me that saying that the European Union should be the body formulating grand strategy in terms of comparison of forces and interests is a bit like saying, I don't know, the Delian League should have defined grand strategy in the Peloponnesian War without the participation of Athens. And so, please tell me why.
They might have been, that's right. They might have won, actually.
So we have, I know that Lars-Erik had a sort of response there, so shall we go?
No, let's take the
Let's go this
first.
way then, yeah, please. So, go ahead, Scen, if you want to.
Oh, well, to take the last point, I mean, sure, the EU was not created for that purpose, but that in my view is not an argument. It's not because it was not the original purpose that cannot be the purpose today, right? I mean, organizations change. The way why I think the EU is a better place is because this comprehensive approach that everybody keeps banging on about, if it's really comprehensive, it includes all of foreign policy or external action. So it includes external trade, it includes development, it includes diplomacy, it includes defense. Only one of those can be dealt with through NATO, really. All the others are outside its purview. So if you want to make a collective European policy, a strategy on that, the obvious body to use would be the EU, at least to set the strategy, because all of that is within the remit of the EU.
Well, and that's why I said G7, because G7 can also coordinate all of those things.
Yeah, but the G7 includes, I don't know what, I'm talking about European strategy, right? If I want to make European strategy, I want to sit around the table with Europeans, because we have European interests. Now, very often European interests coincide with American and Canadian interests, but not always, you know. We have known that we have learned two successive lessons, or we ought to learn two successive lessons. One, we cannot always automatically count on North American allies to solve our problems. And you know, why should they? I mean, they're only right? The US initially said, and when the war in Yugoslavia started, we don't have a dog in this fight. They only came in when they were in a way forced to, because Europeans failed. Two, we learned that even when the United States does intervene, it can actually be entirely against our interest, like invading Iraq in 2003. So my point of view is you need a space where Europeans alone can make strategy, not to necessarily have another strategy than the United States. That's not the point, but to have a place where they can define strategy in function of our interest and our values. And then the EU is for me, the obvious body, but I agree, not everybody, far from everybody accepts that, and that relates to Bert's point. It depends on your political project for the EU. You know, successive Belgian foreign ministries are on record as saying that they would even want to supranationalize the CFSP part of the EU, but you know, you don't find many foreign ministers from other member states saying that, unfortunately. Ours are right, of course. I have to say that. Did I mention that the MFA funds the Institute? You know that now. But that's definitely my point of view. So my ideal EU-NATO relationship will be in a way that the EU-NATO relationship, on topics where we decide to act collectively through the EU, then takes primacy over what member states say in NATO. That if you say, for example, through the EU you agree how you want to deal with the Ukraine crisis and Russia, but then when the debate happens in NATO, that is the main debate between that EU point of view and NATO, and that you don't get again all the EU member states have another thing to say in NATO. And so as to say, okay, CFSP will not quickly replace national foreign policy, but at least on some big topics, member states ought to accept that it might be better to defend their national interest to do it collectively, and then effectively let the EU, let BERT do it instead of trying to do it themselves. That would be my point. And the nominee format, for example, yes, I have nothing against that, and I also know that then afterwards, after Minsk, Merkel comes to Washington to report, also reports to the EU, and of course part of the thing in the background is the EU sanctions, so cannot detach it from the collective.
Lars-Erik, please.
Well, can I just add a few of my own experiences to the issue of first EU and NATO? I think it's been a learning process, obviously. I started up as the Commission representative to the PSC NAC meeting from the start, and I stayed there for a number of years until 2007. What I saw there was a remarkable development of, people got to know each other. In parallel, the security and defense agenda in Brussels, which was a sort of a non-official, sponsored by Solana, by Chris Patton and by Lord Robertson at the time, started to build up an informal interlocutor. We discussed all kinds of things. We discussed the bio threats. They brought in the commissioner for that. We discussed industry. We brought in Verheugen, etc. So it was a remarkable get to know each other period. In the EU Military Committee, where I was the commission representative in the Military Committee, I saw the perm reps who were both NATO and EU perm reps together with your good and my good friend Joe Coleman, of course. Enormous learning process where they had developed a great respect, I think, for what the EU could do and great interest in what the EU could do in all different areas over the years. So clearly, here we had a strong engagement from Solana from the beginning because he came from NATO and he brought a lot of people from NATO into the system. Perhaps I would think that we took a little bit too much from NATO. A little bit too much. We took too much of the security regulations. We actually could have done with a little bit less micromanagement of the CSDP security because to make it easier for them to interact with other parts of the EU and so forth. But by and large, it was a very helpful development. Whereas on the OSCE side, my experience is completely different from the beginning. Solana, contrary to what you might think, did not at all engage on the OSCE. Because he had no delegation in Vienna, it was a commission delegation. He hardly ever went to an OSCE ministerial, very seldom. The commissioners went from time to time, but not always. All of this changed completely after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, where you had a very short and direct line of command from Ashton through the political director of the External Action Service. The whole thing was coordinated through the geographic service of the External Action Service, not the multilateral, but the people who had hands-on policy experience, what to do with our Russian, etc. Relationships. So there, I think we have come into a completely different situation than we were before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. The problem with the literature is, I think, would be useful to discuss, but the question of how you search the literature here. Because I'm very surprised. I've been working now for about 20 years with scholars who are engaged on OSCE and EU and so on. Both in Russia, in Poland, in Switzerland and others, there is an important body of international literature on multilateralism and so on in this, which does not seem to get into the Google Scholar search. How this is being, what kind of discipline you are referring to here, because I don't really know how to not include that empirical literature. Thank you.
Other questions from the floor? Anybody?
If not, we'll have time to do this informally here, as now's the time for a break. It's perfect timing for a break. We will reconvene at 11?
Yeah, let's say 11.
Yeah, that way we can push it back a little bit more. So,
and feel free to come up and
exactly.
ask the questions that you didn't dare to ask publicly in private of all of our participants. So thank you very much, and thank you to all our participants.
Shuffle the deck for panel 2.
Now let's continue. Yeah.